This is lecture number 19, the last lecture of this term for Thursday, May 21st. And we are going to be talking about the age of revolutions and the rise of ideologies. And essentially what I'm going to be talking about here is the legacy of the French Revolution. So the first sort of impact of the French Revolution was part of a larger movement called the Age of Revolutions. And this really began with the American Revolution in 1776. And then there were some attempted revolutions in, say, Holland in the late 1780s. But then you have the French Revolution, which really toppled governments all over Europe. And then you have the spread, because of the French Revolution, you have the spread of revolution to Latin America, and you have the whole string of Latin American revolutions from Spain between 1812 and the 1840s. And then finally you have a series of revolutions back in Europe. I mentioned all the turmoil of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, but then even after the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in France, you had a revolution in 1830 in France that toppled the Bourbon dynasty and brought in the Orleanists, and then the so-called July monarchy. And then in 1848, you had a wave of revolutions across Europe, including France. So this age of revolutions was interesting because usually, I'm going to make some gross overgeneralizations here, and you can find exceptions to these, but in general, each of these revolutions, if you look at how the revolution started and what happened, it was usually, in each of these cases, there was a social hierarchy. You had the aristocrats at the top, and then the middle classes, and then the working classes, and the peasants, etc. In each of the cases, it was usually the second group down on the hierarchy, which was unhappy. They sort of felt blocked, like they couldn't achieve their full potential because of this social structure, and they rejected that social structure in using Enlightenment ideals. And so, for instance, the American Revolutionaries, it was really the leaders, the wealthy elites of the American colonies, the Jeffersons and Washingtons, etc. These are really wealthy guys, often slave owners, etc. These guys really felt that they had hit a glass ceiling because the British functionaries ran things above a certain level in the colonies, and so they really wanted to sort of take control themselves. They were in the second level, they wanted to take control. In the French Revolution, it was often the bourgeoisie who wanted to knock off the aristocrats and get rid of their privileges so the bourgeoisie could achieve their full potential and control things. In Haiti, you had a white elite slave owning class, but the revolution really started with free blacks demanding rights equal to the free whites, and so they were second on that hierarchy. And in Latin American Revolution, the Latin American revolutions were usually led by, similar to the American Revolution, it was the wealthy landowning colonial elites who were basically rejecting European dominance over the colonies. And so in each case, you had this non-aristocratic middle class who was wealthy, often very wealthy, and who wanted to have equal rights to the class above them, either to destroy the privileges of the class above them or to demand access to that class above them. And in every case, they appealed to Enlightenment ideals. The Enlightenment had said that all men are created equal. The Enlightenment had come up with this idea of the social contract, that government is based on a social contract, an agreement between peoples. The Enlightenment had argued that people have human rights. And so those sorts of ideals had been the justification for this revolution in America, in France, etc. And what's interesting about all these is that they generally, what happens is the middle class mobilizes the working class or the lower classes to support them in toppling the upper class. So the middle class, the National Assembly, got the working classes of Paris to support them in toppling the aristocracy. The American big plantation owners like Jefferson and Washington got the urban working classes of Boston and New York, etc., and the small farmers to support them in getting rid of the British dominance. In Haiti, the Haitian Revolution is a little different than the others, but essentially it turns into a slave revolt with the slaves rising up in support of essentially the free blacks in demanding rights against the whites. And in Latin America, these big, large landowning families mobilized the working class and lower class small farming populations to support them in the revolution against Spain. And so in each case you had the middle class is sort of leading the revolution. In each case they use Enlightenment ideals to justify it. There are a couple of exceptions. In some cases, the working classes actually rose up and started to make demands of their own. For instance, in the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution, we saw it in the French Revolution with the sans-culottes demanding, bread in the Constitution of 1793, demanding equality, etc. In the Haitian Revolution, the slaves are demanding the abolition of slavery. And so, in some cases, the working class began to enter the field as an actual, political player with their own demands and their own desires. But often, they were simply used by the middle class to help topple the upper class, and then the middle class asserted its control. So in America, in the United States, you look at the wealthy landowners wind up dominating the early American government, with Washington and Jefferson and Adams and etc. And if you look at the Latin American revolutions, the landowning classes generally dominated these governments that emerged from the revolutions. So the age of revolutions is in a lot of ways, you basically see, it depends on how you want to say the heart of the French Revolution was, but essentially the age of revolution saw this 75 years of turmoil, and there's a lot of patterns across all of these revolutions. And so you can really say that the French Revolution obviously didn't cause the American Revolution, because that had happened before the French Revolution, but the French Revolution caused the Haitian Revolution. Haiti or Saint-Domingue was a colony of France, and the revolt was a direct result of the revolutionary revolts happening in France. And in Latin America, the fact that Spain had its navy destroyed. Spain joined with France at one point and got its navy destroyed at the Battle of Trafalgar along with the French Navy, and that cut off Spain from its colonies, and that set off the series of events that would lead to the revolutions. So in both Haiti and Latin America, these are direct after effects, aftershocks of the French Revolution. It's only the American Revolution which predates the French Revolution. So one way you can think about the importance of the French Revolution is as the largest and most important of the age of revolutions. And in fact, you could even argue that the American Revolution was sort of a one-off, and that the French Revolution actually set off the age of revolutions. Depends on how you want to date it, I guess. All right, then I want to turn now to a second effect of the French Revolution. And that is that the French Revolution really created the ideological spectrum that we think of in politics today. The political ideas we have essentially emerged out of the French Revolution. The one exception to this, which is debatable, is fascism. And it's debatable because fascism is really just a mingling of elements of the other three families. And the three families on this political spectrum, conservatism, liberalism, and radicalism, really, you can trace their roots right into the arguments that they were having in the French Revolution. Now, you can trace their roots a little bit farther back. Conservatism has roots that go way back, well before the French Revolution. Liberalism and radicalism really emerged during the French Revolution, but you can find that they have roots that go back before that to the English Revolution, etc. But the French Revolution really sort of set the tone, and it, in many ways, before the French Revolution, there really was just conservatism. It was the dominant ideology on the continent of Europe for sure. Even England, which was pretty progressive, still was largely dominated by conservative ideas. But in the course of the French Revolution, liberalism and the beginnings of radicalism get articulated. So I want to talk about each of these three different families to come out of the French Revolution. The first is conservatism. Now, as I just mentioned, conservatism has been around for a long time before the French Revolution. In fact, conservatism in many ways was the sort of default idea about just how things were before the French Revolution, before the Age of Revolutions, before the Enlightenment. And conservatism certainly was the dominant idea in the Middle Ages. You can find conservatism as a collection of ideas dominating imperial China throughout millennia. Most of the major societies, the complex societies that developed before the Age of Revolutions, embraced some variation of conservatism. So what is conservatism? Well, first of all, I want to make it clear that when I talk about conservatism here, I am not talking about the people on the right end of the political spectrum in, say, the United States or France or England today. Those people generally, not always, but generally the people we call conservatives today fall into liberalism. And I'll talk about why that's the case in a minute. Instead, what I'm talking about with conservatism is conservatism as the ideology of the Middle Ages, if you will, or conservatism as the ideology of imperial China. And here, conservatism was not clearly articulated as an ideology because there was nothing else. There was no liberalism, there was no radicalism before the French Revolution. And so conservatism was just the way things were. And so nobody really had a name for it. Now, people did talk about the ideas of what, the sort of rules of government and how society should be structured, etc. They talked about that quite a bit, and they articulated the ideas we would recognize as conservatism, but they didn't know they were talking about something called conservatism because that didn't exist as an idea. But basically, conservatism starts with a couple of key assumptions about human beings, and then it elaborates a vision for what society should look like based on those assumptions about human beings. So the first assumption is that conservatism assumes that human beings are fundamentally sinful and prone to doing bad things. Now in Christianity, this is the idea of original sin, that human beings are just intrinsically sinful. They are driven by bodily lusts and greeds and etc. and emotions. And so they're constantly doing bad things. And so a second part of conservatism is that people are generally, some people are better than others and some people are worse than others, but you're generally sort of set at birth, right? That your soul or the nature of your character is pretty much set when you're born, and the rest of your life is the playing out of that character, but it doesn't fundamentally change. And so for conservatism, most people are pretty bad, prone to sin and vice and things like that, and people don't really change, then the question is, how do you manage a society full of people who have this enormous potential to constantly be doing bad things and who will do bad things if you let them? How do you create a stable society out of that? And so the answer is, and different conservative ideologies articulate this in different ways, so I'm just going to stick with sort of Europe. In the Middle Ages, Europeans argued that God actually had a vision for the social structure of society. He realized what human nature was, and he wanted to counteract that by having a social structure that gave everybody a job and a place and a task. And the assumption is God has actually chosen each person based on their character for the task they've been assigned to. And so people who were born into aristocratic families were chosen for that because God recognized their character and put them there in the ruling class. People who are peasants have bad characters, and God put them into peasant class so they could do as little damage as possible, etc. So ultimately, there's this assumption that there's a natural order of things that God has set up, and it corresponds to this idea that the people at the top of the social hierarchy are better, more self-controlled, more rational, more able to be moral, whatever you want to call it, but somehow they are better than the people down the social hierarchy. And that God has chosen them to be at the top because they are better. And conservatism generally thinks that human beings are not very good at thinking through things. The human reason is fine for deciding what to have for lunch or deciding how to organize a garden, but human beings really cannot comprehend all the variables if they're going to try to restructure society or something. And so conservatism generally assumes that you have to not give people, you want to give people as little autonomy as possible, really, because when you start letting them make their own decisions, they tend to make bad decisions. Okay? And so instead, the way the society works then is to try to give everybody a clearly defined role in society and a clearly defined job and task and a clearly defined hierarchy, so everybody knows who's supposed to be obeying whom. And then everybody basically plays out their roles. It's thought that human beings are fine if you give them clearly defined rules and roles and you give them punishments for being bad and rewards for being good, they will generally do what's right. But you need to have those rules, because without the rules, people go off and do bad things, right? And without the threat of punishment, people go off and do bad things. Without clear lines of hierarchy and control, people run off and do bad things. And so each person is sort of thought of as put in a slot, and it should be clearly defined who they're supposed to listen to, who is in charge of them, and who they are in charge of. And it should be very clear what they're supposed to be doing at all times, and it should be very clear what they're not supposed to be doing and what the punishments are for doing what you're not supposed to do. Conservatives tend to not like individualism. They think everything goes wrong when you give individuals freedom to do what they want to do, because what they want to do is murder each other and have sex outside of marriage and get drunk and etc. And so conservatism, with this vision of human beings, it tends to propose that society should be arranged with clear hierarchies. You're born into a position in society and you stay there your whole life. They don't like social mobility. They don't want people rising up and falling in classes. They want set classes, and they want set roles for everybody in the class. And they want to have the government's job is pretty much to enforce a set of rules. You can sort of think of it this way: that in medieval Europe, government's job was to say, we want to get people into heaven, but if they sin, they won't get into heaven. So government's job is to prevent people from sinning. It's to keep order so that people aren't allowed to sin. And that'll get them into heaven, right? So we're going to protect them from themselves by strictly enforcing the rules. So in medieval Europe and in conservatism in general, at the top, one person is in charge. Conservatives love monarchies, right? They love a clear hierarchy, and a monarchy puts the one person in charge. And that's thought to be the way it is, and God will choose who that should be. And so the assumption is the son of a king was chosen by God to be the next king. Right? And then you've got an aristocracy, and they have hereditary titles. They inherit those titles and those positions in society. And so the assumption is that aristocrats have been sort of selected by God to be in that position in society because they are better suited to handle authority and they have more self-control, etc. And so the assumption is that aristocrats, the king watches over the aristocrats and keeps them in line. The aristocrats watch over everybody below them and keep them in line. Everybody is responsible for keeping the people below them in line. Then you have, in conservative society, there could be a middle class that deserves a certain amount of respect for their wealth and industry and running businesses and things. And then you generally have the peasants, the working class down below that, and then the peasants at the bottom, and peasants are seen as sort of the bottom of the class heap. And in all of this, women are generally thought to be sort of one notch below men, and the assumption here is that women, by their nature or what have you, are not as good as men at controlling themselves, and so although an aristocratic woman is better than a middle-class woman at controlling herself, she's not as good as an aristocratic man, and so she should be under the control of her husband, etc. And the assumption is that children are really bad at controlling themselves, so they need to be under strict control of their parents. So conservatism tends to articulate this idea that there's a clear social structure. It tends to be static. You're born into it, you die in it, you don't move out of it. It tends to be patriarchal. Men are placed above women. It tends to be fairly strict in terms of punishments. They're pretty horrific punishments for doing bad things, like the punishment for theft is hanging. The punishment for attacking the king is to be drawn and quartered, have your arms and legs ripped off. And so, generally, conservatism tries to set up a perfect social structure where everybody is clearly obedient to somebody else and in charge of somebody else, and everybody has a clearly defined role. If you're born into a shoemaking family, you're probably going to be a shoemaker. If you're born into a peasant family, you're going to be a peasant. And so it's very clearly defined what everybody's supposed to be doing. Now, conservatives in the larger sense do not think change is a good thing. Because if you've got this social hierarchy where everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing, if something changes, that opens the possibility that people don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They don't have clear instructions for what they're supposed to be doing. And so if people start to wing it or they start to feel they have some freedom, they're going to start doing all sorts of bad things. So change opens up these opportunities for doing bad things. And in addition, the assumption with conservatives, and there's a famous conservative named Edmund Burke, who's an Englishman who wrote the sort of standard definition of conservatism during the French Revolution because he felt the French Revolution was challenging the ideas of conservatism and he wanted to reassert them. And Burke said basically, human beings are not smart enough to change society intentionally. They're going to screw it up. They don't understand all the consequences. They're going to mess things up. So instead, what you should do is look at tradition. Because tradition is only tradition because people have done it for generations. And as they've done it for generations, they've gradually figured out what the ramifications are, how it can go wrong, how it can go right. And they've honed it down through experience to the perfect way to do things. And so tradition is assumed to be the perfect way to do things precisely because it's been tried out for multiple generations and human beings have been gradually getting it right. And so tradition is always thought to be better than innovation. At the very best, Burke says, innovation should be really small and really slow. So tweak something just a little bit and then wait a generation or two to see how that works before you tweak it again. And so as you might guess, conservatism tends to hate revolutions, and they even don't like change. And you might say, well, what kind of a society would conservatives rule over? And the answer is conservatives generally like to rule over agricultural societies with a high number of peasants and subsistence farmers, a fairly small number of cities, and a landowning elite of aristocrats who own all the land. Right? Conservatives are generally very pessimistic. They generally think of history as small periods of stability, followed by periods of suffering and chaos, followed by short periods of stability. And so the best you can hope for is a brief period of stability where everything is going pretty well before the next period of chaos. As you might expect, aristocrats tend to love conservatism because they are at the top of the social heap and they are told they belong there by conservatism. Right? Now, I mentioned that conservatism comes out of the French Revolution, and yet I've been talking about the Middle Ages. Well, essentially what happened was that conservatism was elaborated over the course of the Middle Ages for, literally millennia. And by the time of the French Revolution, it was clearly articulated, but it was not recognized as an ideology because there were no other options, right? Instead, it was just recognized as the way things are, or even better, the way God wants things to be. It's only with the French Revolution that people began to challenge conservatism and to suggest there might be other ways to run the world. And in that case, then you see a number of conservatives come along and say, oh, we have to clearly make our argument now. And so Edmund Burke, during the French Revolution, makes his argument in Reflections on the Revolution in France. Bossuet makes his argument, Bonal. You get a whole bunch of theorists who clearly lay out and articulate a conservative vision of society during the French Revolution or in the wake of the French Revolution, as they're trying to sort of assert that what the French Revolution has challenged was really a good idea in the first place. Right? So that's conservatism. If you have to sum up conservatism in a single word, it would be order. That they're trying to create order in everything. Everything has a place, everyone has a job, everyone knows who they're supposed to be obeying and who they're supposed to be giving orders to. Everything is clear and orderly. That's the best you can hope for. And as you can see, conservatives like monarchy, conservatives like tradition, conservatives like clear social classes with privileges like aristocrats, etc. And that's why I say that most American politicians on the right are not conservatives. And in England, etc., they're not really conservatives. So conservatism was articulated after the French Revolution, during and after the French Revolution, but it had been around for millennia. The other two ideologies were really fairly new. Okay, and the second one I want to talk about is liberalism. Liberalism is essentially the ideology that comes out of the Enlightenment. And liberalism, it really, you can sort of see the beginnings of it articulated with Locke and people like that, or you can see even some interesting beginnings of it in the early 1600s. But it's really in the 1700s that the ideas that come to become liberalism get articulated, and it's really only in the between the 1810s and 40s that liberalism really gets articulated clearly and precisely as here's a political ideology. So liberalism was really, in many ways, the ideas that would come together to become liberalism really are the driving ideas behind the American, the French revolutions, even the British Revolution of the 1600s. These are the ideas that drive those revolutions. Okay, and so just like with conservatism, I'm going to start with a vision of human nature, because the Enlightenment had laid out a new vision of human nature, and I talked about this a little bit way back when. The Enlightenment had argued that human beings are basically rational, right? And moreover, the Enlightenment had argued that human beings are basically good. That if you just raise human beings with reasonably well, they will turn out to be fairly rational and fairly good. Now, here's one of the key innovations of the Enlightenment. John Locke, at the beginning of the Enlightenment, had argued that human beings are born as a blank slate. We don't have a character, we don't have a nature. And then over the course of our lives, we have experiences, we have sensations, we have relationships, we have, horrible things happen to us, good things happen to us, and we learn from all of that, and all of that shapes us. And so Locke sort of sees human beings as we're these rational thinking machines that have no character and no data to work with, but over the course of our lifetimes we accumulate data and experiences, and we think about those things, and that shapes our character and turns us into who we are. We react to the world and we decide what works, and that becomes our character. And so for Locke and liberals, there's an assumption that human beings are what's called perfectible, meaning that you can educate them and you can shape them and you can mold them into something good. And one of the assumptions of liberalism is that, if you have a good education and you raise people right, you can make better people, right? And so something like education reform and coming up with a universal school system is a great idea, because then you can shape more and more better people, right? And so liberalism does not assume that people are static and just born the way they are, the way conservatism does. And liberalism also does not assume that some people are born better than others. Right? Instead, liberalism says, some people are clearly smarter than others, some people are clearly better athletes than others, some people are more artistic, some people speak better, some people have more emotional intelligence, whatever you want to say. But that's the result of their experiences in life and their brains interacting with their experiences. And so liberals tend to say, people have all sorts of different abilities, but it's not as if they were just born that way. They learned that over time. Right? And so liberals tend to say, well, given that, people have all sorts of different abilities and experiences and shapes them, etc., they come up with a couple of key ideas. Number one is they assume that that everybody should have equal rights. If nobody is born better than anybody else, all men are created equal, right? Then they should all have the same rights, and they should be endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, this is different than conservatism, because conservatives are like, no, some people are born aristocrats because God wanted it that way, and some people are born peasants, and so they're born with different rights and different privileges and different, etc. Liberals say, no, everybody's born with the same rights. Now, over the course of your life, there's no way you can make everybody equal, because people have different experiences. Somebody might have some horrible encounter with a bear. Somebody might have a beautiful music teacher who creates this musical genius. Everybody has different experiences. And so liberals say you start off with everybody with equal rights and equal opportunities, but where they end up is up to them, right? Some people will wind up being smarter. Some people wind up being richer. Some people wind up being more talented, more famous, whatever. And that's fine, as long as it was based on their own abilities rather than being given some privilege at the beginning. So liberalism argues with the idea that you start with everybody at an equal place, but then where everybody winds up is up to them. Right? Now, as you might imagine, underlying this is an assumption of individualism. That liberals tend to say each individual should be able to choose the path they want. If people are different because of the way they were raised has made them a different person, then they are the only ones who really know what's going to make them happy. Let them go find what makes them happy. To do that, you have to give them the maximum amount of liberty. And so liberals are very much want everybody to have all sorts of opportunities. If you want to be a doctor, you should become a doctor. If you want to become an artist, you should become an artist. If you want to become an accountant, you should become an accountant. So liberals tend to focus on liberty, individual liberty, and in fact, that's the sort of word. If you had to sum up liberalism in a word, it'd be liberty. And so if this is the case, if everybody should be allowed to find their own path in life and decide what they're going to be, what they're going to do, what does that say about how society should be structured? Well, liberals tend to say you should not have, it's okay to have social classes in the sense that some people are rich and some people are poor, but only if it's the result of hard work and genius and talent and whatever, right? So liberals tend to say everybody should be allowed to do what they're going to do. Well, what's the role of government in all this? Well, government should basically prevent people from hurting each other's liberty. And one of the key ideas of liberalism is that you should be free to do whatever you want to as long as it doesn't affect anybody else's ability to do what they want to. So for instance, if you want to kill somebody, that's not allowed because you're stopping them from fully realizing all the things they want to do in their life by killing them. So murder is not allowed, right? So there's a whole series of things like this that government should be there to protect each person's liberty. Government is there to ensure the rules, the laws, but the laws should be minimal. They should be only necessary to prevent people from inhibiting each other's liberty. Right? And so it's okay for liberals to say there should be a law against pollution because if you're polluting, you're hurting somebody else's health and you're infringing upon their liberty to enjoy life to the fullest. So there should be laws against murder, as I just said, and there should be laws against fraud. You shouldn't be able to fool people and lie to people. But generally, the law should not tell people you have to do this, or it shouldn't force people to be a particular religion. It shouldn't force people to be a particular social class or to live in a particular place or have a particular occupation. It should allow people maximum freedom as long as they're not hurting anybody else. Right? Now, liberals, if they think human beings are rational, pretty smart actually, and they think people should have lots of freedom, liberals assume that human beings are going to constantly be inventing great new stuff, right? They're going to be inventing new technologies, they're going to be inventing new ideas, they're going to be coming up with new ways of understanding the world, they're going to be practicing science. And because of that, liberals tend to assume that human beings are going to constantly be creating progress, right? Because human knowledge is cumulative. Once we know something, we can pass that on to other people, and it becomes a permanent part of the human knowledge base. So the assumption here, and this is coming straight out of the Enlightenment, is that through reason and science, we can make the human condition better and better. And so liberals tend to assume that history is always getting better. The future is going to be better than the past because human beings are constantly going to be working on making things better. Right? All right, as you might imagine, the social class that really embraces liberalism tends to be the middle class. They tend to be very proud of their own accomplishments and abilities, their training, their education, etc., their talents, their special skills. but they don't like, they haven't been given any privileges or special place in the world, so they tend to not like the idea of special privileges and special places in the world because they didn't have it. So they want a meritocracy. They want everyone to be able to have achieve the highest level that they can achieve. And middle class generally sees itself as pretty smart and pretty poised to do really well if they're given the opportunity. So they want maximum liberty. And if you're looking at the French Revolution, I mean, clearly this is the ideology of the king and the old aristocrats, etc., during the French Revolution. Liberalism was the ideology of the moderates. I mean, it's the ideology at first of Abbé Sieyès and people like that. It's the ideology of the Feuillants. It's the ideology of the Girondins, right? And it's the ideology of a lot of the Jacobins who were middle class, right? And so, I mean, think about that conflict during the French Revolution where the sans-culottes are demanding a maximum price on bread, and the Jacobins and the other members of the Constitutional Convention are like, no, we got to have a free market. We got to have maximum liberty of people to buy and sell. We got to let people do what they're doing. Right? So liberalism tends to be the ideology. I mean, it's certainly the ideology of the American founding fathers. Right? It tends to be the ideology of many of the people in the legislature during the French Revolution. And so liberalism winds up sort of becoming the dominant ideology of the 19th century, both in the United States and in England. And then late in the 19th century, liberalism really sort of wins over big chunks of Germany and Italy and France, etc. And in the 20th century, especially after World War II, liberalism really triumphs and becomes the dominant ideology outside of the Soviet bloc. It becomes the dominant ideology. So again, if you have to sum up liberalism, it's maximizing individual liberty. All right. Let me turn to the last family, which is radicalism. And radicalism, it's certainly got its roots. It's got its roots in Rousseau. It's got its roots in the Enlightenment, and it certainly has its roots in the French Revolution. But radicalism wouldn't be clearly articulated as an ideology until later than the other two. It's sort of conservatism had existed for centuries, and during the French Revolution, you have people like Edmund Burke laying out conservatism, and liberalism sort of comes together during the French Revolution, but it's not clearly quite articulated until later when you have people like John Stuart Mill articulating clearly what liberalism is in the 1830s and 40s. Radicalism is a bit later still. Right? Radicalism, you can see it starting to form in the 1820s and 30s, or even earlier with Saint-Simon, etc. But it really comes into its own in the 1840s and 50s, and it's really only in the latter half of the 19th century that you really see become a significant social movement. And then, of course, in the 20th century, you have all sorts of communist revolutions and things like that. Radicalism is in many ways also a child of the Enlightenment, right? Because radicals would agree that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Radicals would agree with that too. The difference is that liberals tend to assume that people have different abilities naturally, that there are natural differences in abilities and whatever, and so there's a sort of a natural hierarchy. The talented people will rise to the top. Radicals tend to say, no, you know what? We think people are really equal. And in fact, we're going to demand not just that everyone gets an equal opportunity, but also that everyone winds up with an equal share at the end. So liberals tend to say, well, as long as everyone has an equal opportunity and can maximize their talents, if some people wind up richer than other people, that's fine. Radicals say, no, nobody should wind up richer than somebody else, right? That everybody should have. We should distribute wealth equally. We should distribute, everything equally, right? So radicalism, if there's one word that sums it up, it's equality. So radicals basically, their argument goes like this. I mean, with the other two, I started with human nature. So the radicals generally assume that human beings are rational and good, and they actually have a much stronger sense of that than even liberals. that they assume that everybody is rational and good. Now, liberals often think that, you know, the working class or peasants or something haven't had much education, their life hasn't broadened their horizons much, so, you know, they had potential, but they really are not that smart, according to liberals. They really think of the lower classes as down there because they don't have much talent or intelligence. Radicals say, no, no, no. They're not down there because they lack intelligence. They're just as smart as the people at the top of society. It's just a matter of opportunity. The structure was set up, the system was set up to screw them over and push them down there. They're just as smart as everyone else. So radicals tend to take their equality seriously, and they say everybody is smart, everybody can be good, everybody has talents and abilities. Now, radicals also essentially, similar to liberalism, because this is coming out of the Enlightenment, they argue that human beings are shaped by their environment. Think about what I talked about in this class with Marxism. Marx argues that your social class shapes everything about you. Radicals agree with that. I mean, Marx was a radical. They basically say that you are a blank slate, and a peasant is born just as good as an aristocrat, and you can switch the two and they turn out, you know, the same way. The difference is that peasants are shaped by growing up in a peasant environment, and aristocrats are shaped by growing up in an aristocratic environment, etc. And so radicals tend to argue, even more so than liberals, radicals tend to argue that people totally are absolutely equal, and it's circumstances, education, and environmental factors that shape everything. So to put it slightly differently, you know, conservatives think it's entirely nature, people are just born that way. Liberals think it's mostly nature, you know, mostly nurture, that people are shaped by education, but they do think there's some inequalities of natural talent and ability. Radicals say no, everything is environmental, no, there are no differences in natural talent or ability. I'm overstating it slightly, but that's basically where radicals come down. And so radicals then say, well, if everybody's really equal, and everybody should have equal rights, and everybody could really be doing everything that anyone else is doing, how do you structure society? Well, radicals really have a strong sense that in the past, society has been structured to help certain people, right? That the Middle Ages was structured to get aristocrats rich and to get them have them live a nice, wonderful life, and peasants have a horrible life and they're on the verge of starvation all the time. And even in the 19th century, radicals argue, you know, you have this big factory system. Well, the John D. Rockefellers and such are getting rich and living really nice lives, but the factory workers are living horrible lives because they're getting exploited. And so the radicals tend to say, you know, people are equal, and if society is unequal, it's because the system has been set up to make them unequal. And so radicals tend to focus on the system and say, the system is not working for everybody unless you have true equality. And so radicals really see human beings as dramatically shapeable, right? The education and social class and experience profoundly shape people. And because of that, radicals think that the only way to truly have a good society is to create a system that creates radical equality. And basically radicals argue there shouldn't be rich people, because if there's rich people, that means there are poor people, and that means somebody's getting deprived of something, and they have a right to it. You should have equality. And so radicals tend to focus much more on community and cooperation than on individualism. Or to put it slightly differently, liberals say every individual should be able to go out and do what they can do, and if they get rich, more power to them, that's great, they earned it. Radicals say, no, if they got rich, they're screwing somebody over, they didn't earn it. And so we need, as a community, to make sure that no individuals are screwing over any other individuals. We need to constantly, as a community, be watching ourselves to make sure that we're not screwing our neighbors over. And in particular, we need to be very careful about the system itself and make sure that it's not favoring some groups of people and giving them advantages and privileges. We need to make sure the system treats everybody equally. And so radicals tend to They argue that a perfect system would allow each individual to live a full and satisfying life. Every single individual should live a full and satisfying life. There should be no poverty. There should be no hardship. But that means that society has to be constantly saying, we can't let anybody get too rich, because if we let people get too rich, that means somebody's going to be poor. And so we have to constantly be redistributing things and focusing on what's good for the overall community. And this should sound like Rousseau, because Rousseau is a major influence here. Remember Rousseau's idea of virtue? What Robespierre picked up was that each individual should want what's best for the community as a whole, not what's best for them as an individual. Well, liberalism says no, each individual runs around doing what's best for them as an individual, and that's fine. Radicalism says no, each person should have Rousseau's idea of virtue. Each person should be doing what's good for the community as a whole before what's good for them as an individual. And so radicals tend to dislike competition. Liberals are like, hey, a capitalist competitive system, a free market system, that's a great idea, because that allows each individual to compete and to maximize their, to find out what they can do and to really live up to their full potential, because it's open competition. So liberals love a free market system, capitalism. Radicals don't. They say, no. If you have competition, there's winners and there's losers, and then you wind up with inequality, which is not good. And so radicals tend to say, well, no, let's come up with a way for cooperation. Let's work together. Let's design a system where we all can work together on it, and it produces something good for everybody. And so radicals tend to like more controlled economies. They tend to like socialist policies, a big welfare system, a social safety net, a good healthcare system, childcare, etc. But they also, in some cases like communism, they want a whole economy that is managed and controlled so that it doesn't produce inequality. Radicals share with liberals the idea that history is moving towards better things. They argue that human beings are learning over time how to do things. Now, liberals would point to science and technology and say, we're learning new science and new inventions, and that makes human life better. Radicals would say, yeah, inventions are great, but what we're really learning is we're learning how to make a better society. We're learning how to organize society better over time, and that's why life is getting better. Right? Now, as you might guess, given the focus on equality and redistributing wealth and not liking competition, the class that radicalism appeals to the most is the working class. Right? And traditionally, radicalism, communism, socialism, etc., anarchism have been working class ideologies. And it's really only in the latter half of the 19th century that you start to see working class radical movements like communists, the International, etc., social democratic parties emerge. Now, that does not mean that you don't sometimes have middle class radicals, and you might have lower class people who embrace conservatism or liberalism. And that's fine. I'm just saying that predominantly, aristocrats tend to like conservatism, middle class people tend to like liberalism, and working class people tend to like radicalism. Now, I just want to point out that all this came out of the French Revolution. That essentially, when the French Revolution happens, all those aristocrats who suddenly saw their privileges taken away, they begin to really say, well, geez, how should society be organized? And they articulate the ideas of conservatism. Okay? And the Catholic Church often embraces the ideas of conservatism. Liberalism is really the ideology of the middle class that comes out of the Age of Revolutions. That the founding fathers of the United States embraced liberalism. They were upper middle class, they were wealthy, they thought they were talented, they wanted careers open to talent so they could reach their full potential, and they built a system that allowed them to do that. Right? But it produced big variations in wealth and poverty, as the United States has seen over time. But it was built around the idea of competition, it was built around the idea of giving people education, it was built on the idea of giving people equal rights, so everyone had equal opportunities, but it does not guarantee equal outcomes, it does not guarantee that everyone's equal at the end, because free competition allows some people to win and some people to lose. Liberals are fine with that. In the French Revolution, the Girondins, the Feuillants, lots of members of the convention were essentially liberals, right? Especially after the National Assembly is gone. And the conflict between the convention on the one hand and the sans-culottes on the other, where the sans-culottes are storming the convention and then the convention is bringing in the National Guard to clear the room and whatever, the convention generally represents liberalism. And the sans-culottes generally represent radicalism. And so that's the last piece here is that in the French Revolution, the working classes of the cities, especially Paris, the sans-culottes, are the first to begin articulating the ideas of radicalism, right? And that's why they liked the Constitution of 1793. It gave everybody the vote. It gave everyone access to power. Whereas the liberals tend to say, no, let's have the people who've already shown they're capable by earning money, let's have them be eligible for the vote and have power, right? And so radicalism tends to be the ideology of the sans-culottes. And they don't articulate it clearly during the French Revolution, but over the course of the 19th century, radicalism would be articulated as an ideology. And it really starts, you can see it, I mean, the first person who really articulated a radical idea was Babeuf, Gracchus Babeuf in 1795 to 97. He's really articulating something that's close to radicalism. All right, so overall then, the French Revolution, or maybe the Age of Revolutions, but really the French Revolution is key in this, gives us these three ideological families, and these are really a spectrum, right? There are conservatives who are totally conservative, and there are conservatives who like a little bit of liberalism, and there are liberals who are totally liberal, and there are liberals who are a little bit radical, etc. So it's a spectrum. But basically, this defines the political ideas of Western societies, Europe and the United States, etc., from the French Revolution up until, today, really. Things are getting a little muddled today, but I'll talk about that in a different time. So this is the sort of legacy of the French Revolution, or at least this is two of the legacies. One is this age of revolutions that overthrows the old order across Europe, across Latin America, and creates countries like the United States and shakes up and destroys the old medieval social hierarchies. The second is an ideological legacy, that the French Revolution leaves us with a set of ideas, or three sets of ideas, that are in conflict with each other, and the argument about those ideas has been ongoing ever since. So that's it for the French Revolution class. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a great summer.